Are you waiting for me? You are.
No, we're watching people
Okay.
show up. So welcome folks who are just joining us. We're going to wait a few minutes just to let people trickle in, and then we'll kick off this second forum on the ReCode code evaluation.
All right.
We've got about 10 folks and it seems like it's slowed down a little bit. So we might wait 30 seconds more or so, Christine, and then you probably can get going.
Okay, great. All right. One sec here. So got 16 participants, looks like. So we'll, and it's 6:02. So we'll get started. So good evening, everyone. And welcome and thank you for taking time out of your evening to attend tonight's ReCode Forum. For those of you joining us who were with us yesterday, welcome back. I'm Christine Grimando. I'm the Director of Planning and Urban Development. And ReCode is a major project for us and for the city. And it is where many big and pressing issues that we are working on right now and that are facing the city will be implemented. And some of the ways it will be implemented are quiet and subtle, and some are going to be big too. And hearing from people like at forums this evening and all the other ways that they're going to be to contribute to this project are so important to shaping this project and ultimately shaping the future of Portland. So this is one or a number of different ways to contribute to this multi-year project. And this is, we're going to try some new things and ways of talking about these topics tonight. And I know I'm really looking forward to it. I'm joined this evening by two of my colleagues in the department, Planning and Urban Development Department, Nell Donaldson, Director of Special Projects, and our ReCode Project Manager, Matt Grooms, Senior Planner, also a critical part of the ReCode team. And also here are Chris Turnett and Arista Strungus with Camiros, our ReCode consultants, who have been invaluable so far on bringing ideas and this code evaluation to the city. And they're going to be leading the presentation tonight. And with that, Chris, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks, Christine. Thanks everybody for joining us. And if you came back for the second time, extra thanks. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen here, hoping that everyone can see the presentation. Can I get a thumbs up from my team? All right, excellent. So if you joined us last night, the format will be familiar. If you're just joining us for the first time, we're going to kind of take this in three pieces. So the first piece tonight is going to be a discussion about complete neighborhoods. That'll be occurring from 6 to 6:40. We'll be taking a quick 5-minute break before we move on to the built environment, which will be from 6:45 to about 7:25. Another quick 5-minute break, and then we'll talk about economic development. Firstly, just want to welcome you all and really wholeheartedly thank you for attending. We're really looking forward to these forums as a way for residents of Portland to tell us what they think, tell us what you think of the ideas that we're putting forward in the land use code evaluation. We're really looking at these events as a way for you to provide feedback and to ask questions and make comments, specifically in this first section about the complete neighborhoods focused recommendations. And so to facilitate that, we are using a tool called Slido. So if you are on your laptop or desktop computer, what you can do is you can open up a browser window and kind of move it to the side of where the Zoom presentation is showing up for you. Type in slido.com. You enter this little 6-digit number and you're going to get plugged in to the system to participate in all of our interactive elements of the presentation tonight. What I would recommend, even if you do have a computer in front of you, is consider using your smartphone. Scan this QR code or just open up the browser on your smartphone, type in slido.com, 6-digit code goes in there. And that's a little bit smoother way of participating because you can have all the real estate on your screen and just participate on your smartphone. I don't see any phone numbers here in the list of attendees, so I'm pretty confident that we don't have anybody that's just joined by phone. So I will hold off on those instructions. So give everybody about a minute to see how many folks we can get logged in. And then I will move on to a quick description of how that platform is going to work. I wish this slide played music or something. It would be a little bit more soothing as everyone was joining. Okay, let's move on. So what you will see when you are able to join the Slido, whether you're on your phone or on your computer, it's going to look very similar. The first thing here that you see highlighted is polls. And so this is where any live polls that we're conducting as part of the event tonight are going to show up. This is where you'll participate and submit your responses. If you have any questions, we would encourage you to go to the Q&A tab. We're going to be monitoring this. We are a small team, but we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions, and we'd encourage you to type those in here. Would also encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to include your name with your comment. This will allow us to follow up if we have to. But you can, if you're more comfortable, submit a question anonymously. Another kind of interesting feature here is the ability to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to other questions. If you see a question that someone else has asked, give it a thumbs up if you want to see an answer to that question or if you want to see it discussed. That gives us some sort of an idea of what people's sentiment toward specific questions is. Also want to note that when we get further on in the presentation, there will be an opportunity for you to actually raise your hand in the Zoom webinar and actually verbally ask us a question. So if you're not comfortable or you can't get into Slido for some reason, take heart, there will be an opportunity for you to still ask your question. If you have comments, so ideas and comments that don't necessarily require a response from us right now, we would encourage you to just type your ideas into the Ideas tab. We're also going to be looking at these and following the meeting. This will be a good resource for us to look and see if we've got really good ideas coming out of the attendees here. So just to see if everyone is plugged in and how things are working, and not at all because I'm excited to come to Portland and try some of the local restaurants and I'm looking for recommendations. Just thought an interesting icebreaker would be, what's your favorite restaurant in Portland? Ooh. I'm intrigued by some of these. All right, so it looks like we've got about 10 responses out of about 18 attendees. So we'll give it another minute, see if we can get anybody that wants to join the Slido able to get in there and start answering. This may also just be a very hard question. I'm sure that there are lots and lots of options. Okay, we're up to 12. Okay, so moving onward and really kind of starting to get into a little bit of the meat here. Just want to kind of take a pulse of the people that we've got here with us tonight. Just how familiar are you with the comprehensive plan and the land use code? Are these things that you have skimmed? Are these things that you are working with on the regular? Are these things that you kind of know that they exist, but you haven't really looked at them, or you don't know what they are at all, which is also legitimate. So it looks like we've got a variety going on here. Some people are, looks like most people are somewhat unfamiliar, know what they are, but not necessarily having read them. A lot of people very familiar, or at least somewhat familiar. So this is great. Okay. Well, for those of you who aren't as familiar, Portland's plan. It's really where the policy lives on the city side of things. So this is where the city is communicating its vision for the future, its key policy goals, things that it wants to see happen over the planning horizon of the plan, which reaches out to looking at 2030. Regulations, obviously, are sort of the key implementation tool for city policies, right? These are the rules that govern development. So if we're talking about policy specifically related to this idea of complete neighborhoods, which is our first topic tonight, what the city has said in its planning and its policy documents is that they want to advance land use that supports this idea of complete neighborhoods. And when we say complete neighborhoods, what we really mean is places within the city of Portland where everybody, regardless of their age, physical ability, income, has access to goods, services, and amenities that will really serve them in their day-to-day life, right? So access to schools, access to opportunities to buy and eat food, access to open space, other civic functions, amenities, and services. So basically everything that you need to conduct your day-to-day life within easy walkable or bikeable distance to where you're living. That would be a complete neighborhood. And one of the key policy goals is to encourage contextually appropriate density within residential areas proximate to transit nodes and corridors to really get at this idea and to support this idea of complete neighborhoods, allowing people to live in higher densities where these services exist. So you can see sort of a disconnect here, right, between the idea of policy, which are these sort of larger goals, and then the regulations, which very specifically address sort of key regulatory categories, right? So things like uses and use standards, dimensional and design controls, parking, landscape. Kind of difficult to draw a direct line from one of these policy goals to a specific area of the regulations. Excuse me. And so that's where the land use code evaluation comes in. So the land use code evaluation is this piece in the middle that's outlining a series of techniques and approaches that are going to bridge the gap between these larger policy ideas and smaller tweaks that we can make within the regulations. Some are going to be smaller tweaks, some are going to be larger, but tweaks that we can make within the regulations to really work toward implementing those policies. And so what you see in the land use code evaluation is a series of recommendations that really serve to be those connections between the policy and the regulation. Things like adding pockets of mixed use zoning to neighborhoods or allowing different types of neighborhood scale retails within actual residential zones. And so I'm going to go through some of the key recommendations here and just broadly outline those for us here tonight. So one of them, the first, is adding pockets of mixed use zoning to neighborhoods. So if you look at a lot of the neighborhoods in Portland, many of them historically had areas where neighborhood scale retail would locate. Things like the neighborhood bar, the neighborhood corner store. Those spaces still exist within the community. Are there ways that we can identify them and work to rezone them, add mixed use zoning back in a way that enables these types of things to come back into the neighborhoods in a way that makes sense? We're talking about sort of small scale, neighborhood scale, low impact retail corner store type uses. Another way to get at this is to look actually at the neighborhood zoning itself, the residential zoning, and see where there may be opportunities just to allow some low impact, small neighborhood scale commercial uses within the actual residential zones themselves. So where we might add new permitted uses within those zones so that they could just happen within certain contexts in neighborhoods. Encouraging transit-oriented development along transit corridors. So building in additional density where it makes sense, where people want to live, want to locate close to amenities, close to transit, and doing things like allowing additional height there and requiring additional amenities and design features that are really oriented toward making these walkable, pedestrian-oriented environments. Refining the mixed-use zones in a number of ways to better support sustainable, walkable development. The first one would be to expand the list of neighborhood scale commercial uses that are allowed within sort of these smaller neighborhood centers, these smaller neighborhood nodes. A good example of this would be the B1 and the B1B zones. These are currently sort of very small transitional sort of neighborhood scale business zones. And so as we're thinking about sort of the scope of uses that are going to exist within the city moving forward, are there opportunities to diversify, to allow some more stuff in that's low impact, that really gets at the nature of what we're talking about with the complete neighborhood within those zones? The second way is thinking about increasing the permitted heights within major commercial centers and along corridors where it makes sense. One example of this would be the B2 zone. So thinking about height as an incentive to achieve the type of mixed use development that we want to see to really allow that density that's going to help with this idea of creating a complete neighborhood. Eliminating the distinction between on peninsula and off peninsula that currently exists within some of these mixed use zones. And what I say when I mean that is that, for instance, in the B1 and the B2, currently there are standards that say if I'm in, say I'm in the B1 zone and I'm on peninsula, I need X amount of square feet per dwelling unit that I'm going to build. But if I'm off peninsula, I need some other higher number of square feet per dwelling unit for whatever I'm going to build. And that seems to be a distinction without a difference in terms of the zone, because the zone is the same. And as a tool, the thinking is that it should just work how it works, and that a distinction or a differentiation between on and off peninsula isn't needed and might be standing in the way of kind of creating these more complete neighborhoods. Thinking about adjusting dimensional standards within these districts and just allowing housing as a permitted use within all of the city's mixed use zones, which includes the B4 zone, which currently doesn't allow any residential. An example of the B4 is on Warren Ave on parts of Riverside Street, typically considered to be a little bit more auto oriented, but just allowing residential development to happen everywhere in the city. So I've just outlined a number of key recommendations. We're hoping that you'd be willing to let us know what you think the most important ones are. So hoping that you can identify your top 3 in order. Just click 1, 2, 3, and then we'll see sort of how we're sitting with these recommendations. And the poll is live.
I love how this sort of encourages you to think you know where it's going. Keeps changing, keeps us on our
toes. Lesson last
toes.
night by trying to develop observations before everyone had voted, right? Things shift around the more votes we get. So, I mean, it's looking like adding neighborhood scale retail uses to residential zoning and pockets of mixed use zoning to neighborhoods are kind of up there in the top, as well as encouraging transit-oriented development. See, it just happened. Eliminating the distinction jumped up. So this is great. We've got 18 votes. So yeah, looks like adding neighborhood scale retail and adding pockets of mixed use zoning are the top 2, which is great. So just to contrast that, the findings so far from the survey tool that's available on the ReCode Portland website that's asking specifically about some of these complete neighborhoods recommendations. And we can see here that, there's broad support for most of these. What we're looking at here is everyone who's taken the survey so far has ranked these initiatives on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being, I don't necessarily support this, 5 being, I support this. I greatly support this, right? And so what we've got here going on is that level of 1 is the lightest blue color and a level of 5 is the darker blue color. So what we can see is that broadly there is quite a bit of support for all of these recommendations among people who've taken the survey. It seems like encouraging transit-oriented development is one of the more popular ones, as well as adding pockets of mixed-use zoning to neighborhoods and expanding neighborhood scale commercial uses allowed in small neighborhood centers. So everybody's kind of thinking similarly, I think, about these recommendations in terms of what they want their neighborhoods to look like in the future. We can see also that there are some that have a little bit more variability in terms of people supporting them on a scale of 1 to 5, right? So increasing permitted height seems to be something that's creating potentially a little bit of a conversation among certain folks. So it's good for us to know where there is a little bit more variability in terms of the levels of support, so that as we're working through to implement these recommendations, we're making sure that we're doing it in a way that's going to bring along as much support as we can possibly get. So with this in mind, wondering if anybody here on the call with us tonight has any ideas of things that we might have left out. So in terms of complete neighborhoods and moving the city's policy closer toward implementation through changes to the land use code, can you think of anything that we haven't considered that might be a tool or technique to move us a little bit closer? And we'll take just a minute in case anyone has any great ideas. Sidewalks, always important. Adding the B1B neighborhood business uses to all zones that are already low impact. There's another idea. Row house and townhouse styles. Some comments about removing parking minimums and traffic calming. So these are all good. All right. Tram for Commercial Street. Yep, adding clarity to the definitions is certainly another thing to do as well. Make sure to add more bike paths. Okay, so these are all really great ideas, and I would encourage you all. So these will be logged as you've entered them in here. And if you have more or you'd like to expand, the ideas tab within Slido, there's the place to do that. So we're going to move on to some questions that have come in. We've had our team kind of behind the scenes here, adding a star to some of the questions here so that we can discuss them. Eric thinks it's a cool platform to use. Thanks, Eric. Looks like Christopher is saying, how will ReCode try to encourage corner or mom and pop grocery stores like you find in the North End and in New York City? And so that's a really good question. And a couple of the tools that we've talked about are the ways that we're kind of exploring for how to allow that, right? So the first way that we've talked about is this idea of identifying where it makes sense for those to go and then actually just switching the zoning, right? Putting something like an expanded B1 in place that would allow those types of mom and pops or corner stores to just naturally locate where the zoning takes place. The other way is to take a look at the actual neighborhood zones themselves and see if there's a way for us to work in those permissions within the neighborhood zones, right? So where a corner store might make sense, maybe there's a new corner store use or neighborhood commercial establishment use that gets put in that's got a certain set of use standards that say that it can locate in certain locations within residential districts. We're exploring kind of a couple different avenues to allow this to happen. but we take the question, obviously, and if you have any specific ideas that you think that we've missed, we're happy to hear those too. And obviously, as we get into the drafting process, you'll be able to see how these manifest in language, and we look forward to your comments when we get to that point as well. Everybody on my team here, feel free to jump in and expand as needed. What's the definition of a complete neighborhood, and what zoning changes would help promote this? So a complete neighborhood, there is no one definition, I don't think. I'm not sure if it's in Merriam-Webster. But as far as Portland's plan is concerned, what we're talking about with complete neighborhood is a neighborhood where people, regardless of their age, regardless of their financial situation, their education, their physical ability, have access to the things that they need on a daily basis. And it's equitable access, right? So I've got access to food, I've got access to schools. Maybe I have access to employment even within the neighborhood. I have access to transit. The idea is equity of access to everything that I need to kind of live my daily life without necessarily having to go far or to get in a car. So things that would be located within a walkable or a bikeable distance. And zoning changes that could allow that type of thing to happen are basically just what we've been talking about, being a little bit more permissive about where neighborhood or residential zoning is allowed to mix with a little bit more in terms of the retail or the commercial side. So where residential mixes into mixed use and then into commercial or pure mixed use zones. Okay. Does this encourage local shopping and entertainment, or discourage shopping and entertainment beyond the city boundaries?
And Chris, I did respond to that in the chat.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Just to chime in so that we're on the same page. It does tend to encourage local shopping and entertainment. It encourages people to shop local. You get restaurants that people want to frequent, whether it be, as Chris said, you can walk there, you can bike there. It's much easier to get there. And so it does, in particular, convenience commercial, it is very beneficial in that way, creating districts that operate in this manner. It doesn't necessarily take everybody outside of the city boundaries. It depends on sometimes where the Costco is, where the Home Depot is, as people, look at these regional commercial centers. So it's not all of a sudden everybody's just going to be local, but it does have a lot of benefit in terms of that, of kind of upping where you would be shopping more locally.
Great. Thanks, Rista. General feedback. Thanks, Elizabeth. Happy that it seems to be working out well for you so far. I think we addressed this one as well. So what is neighborhood-friendly retail? Examples. Neighborhood-friendly retail could be a variety of things. I'm not sure if anyone answered this in the chat. Let me make sure. Doesn't look like it. Okay. So small neighborhood corner stores, right? So things that have a relatively low impact on the adjacent residential uses. And this could be a variety of things. And, honestly, it varies from place to place, right? And it varies depending on what people are comfortable with. It could be something like a coffee shop or a small neighborhood cafe or restaurant. It could be a small bookstore. It could be, your mom and pop, corner store where you go to buy sundries or a gallon of milk if you need it. It's basically a kind of a discussion of scale and impact. So things that don't have big parking lots, things that aren't making a lot of noise, things that are basically just serving as a resource for the immediate neighbors and the local community. Okay, and then Northgate used to have some cool stores like Troiano's until the banks took over, and then the pharmacies. We should discourage major changes like that. So kind of hard to do in terms of zoning. And I think we've talked sort of about zoning and the land use code as a tool that works over sort of a longer horizon, right? And it can't necessarily make specific things happen. It can't necessarily take specific things away. There are ways that we can look, if the issue is that larger uses are necessarily coming in places that don't necessarily, that aren't best suited to the scale of those types of uses. Those are types of things that we can look at, but in terms of ownership and actual, specific businesses opening up in parts of the city, we really can't get at those types of things through the land use code. Now you unmuted, looks like.
Yeah. I think one thing I would add on both this question and the question before is that one way our existing code deals with this issue is through sort of maximum square footages. And so by controlling for the footprint that any use can actually occupy, which is a common way that codes deal with this issue, right? If your business can only occupy a footprint of 2,000 square feet, that means the Home Depot can't be in the neighborhood, right? And so I think that's a tool that exists in our code already, and one we'll think about moving forward.
Great, thanks, Tom. Okay, so it looks like we've worked our way through most of the questions that were entered through the chat. So if you would like to unmute and actually talk to us, give us a comment, give us some feedback, or ask us a question the old-fashioned way with your voice instead of through the keyboard, now's the time to do it. If you look in your Zoom window, you can see down at the bottom of the screen where you're looking at my presentation, there should be a little raise hand icon. So now's the time to do that.
Great, and I will call on people as I see hands raised. So go ahead and raise your hand now if you're interested in asking a question live here. The first person we have with the hand raised is Zach Borowitz. So Zach, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, thanks again, Zach Borowitz. Because of online shopping, big box stores, a lot of our dreams of having small neighborhood retail might not come true. So what about having some light industrial uses be allowable in some of these neighborhood nodes? I remember one day I needed a knife sharpener, and lo and behold, there was one 2 blocks from my house. You know, low impact, no pollution. You know, not a nuisance. Artist studios, storefront artist studios, things like that. Thanks.
Yeah. I think those are some great ideas. There's a knife sharpener at my farmer's market on the weekends. And he's one of the most popular destinations. You know, I think that there are, and what you're getting at, Zach, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be what we traditionally think of as retail, right? It can be a service that people want within their neighborhood. So if I'm, you know, I might not necessarily be wanting to, you know, walk 2 blocks to buy something that I could have delivered to my front door, but I can't necessarily send my knives out to get sharpened. So we need to kind of think outside of the box in terms of the types of services that people are going to be needing and wanting to use in the future. And I think that definitely one of our goals is to make sure that we're thinking in a way that's flexible and that's future looking in terms of the types of things that people want within their neighborhoods that are also unlikely to not really cause a lot of impacts on the surrounding uses.
Chris, I just want to add to that, sort of building off Nell's earlier comment about scale and sort of some of considerations of what is the neighborhood, a neighborhood offering versus something else, like everything's in someone's neighborhood eventually. But when we're talking about sort of smaller centers, I think a lot of these questions come down to, yes, we want flexibility in uses, but also where there might have been use concerns about certain types of uses. We, you know, Zach mentioned light industrial. I think a lot of consideration of what sort of smaller scale opening up of mixed uses means in this case will come down to making sure we have some performance standards to sort of mitigate potential impacts and scale controls. And a lot of those things will be at least as important as which uses, I think. And so I think that's just good to get out there for this larger discussion of when we talk about use, we want to make sure we capture what we definitely want. But in some ways, we I think thinking about sort of scale and mitigating impacts is critical to making people who may not be yet there or have concerns have a way to feel comfortable, and for us too to feel comfortable about opening those uses up. So maybe that's a thread for this whole subject tonight.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And I think too, you know, the land use code evaluation talks about adding specificity to some categories of uses, right? So if we're thinking about things like low industrial, whereas, previously that might have been a big basket with a lot of different things. And if you'd said, suddenly we're thinking about allowing low industrial in your neighborhood, that's saying one thing, right? But if we split out some of those uses, so we're talking about things, like maybe micro production of alcohol, maybe, like the knife sharpening example, we actually pull out some uses that convey a scale that we'd be more comfortable with. We can start allowing, what are technically low industrial uses into neighborhoods without allowing sort of the full gamut of, low industrial coming into your neighborhood.
All right, we have a question from Todd. Todd, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello, I'm Todd Morse. I live in East Bayside. I really like the program so far, super excited about a lot of the ideas. One question / comment I had is, why couldn't we make the B1B neighborhood business district kind of a global minimum for the whole city? Because there's a lot of language in the zoning code that makes that super low impact. Everything's on the first floor, very limited number of uses. I couldn't imagine being upset if like a B1B business opened up right next door to me. So I was just wondering if that could be possible.
Definitely take that comment. I think that that's something that would require some additional discussion, I think. And I'm not sure if you mean a global minimum in terms of just sort of the uses that are allowed within the B1B being sort of the baseline. If we're having this conversation about allowing more in residential zones, if the idea is just kind of pulling from the B1B and expanding those across the board. My sense is that that's what you're saying. I'm not sure if you're...
Yeah, basically in all residential zones, allowing the B1B.
Allowing the B1B set of uses.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so if we're looking at expanding the sort of the commercial uses or the mixed use component into residential zones, I think that the B1B is a logical place to look and to start pulling things in from. I think as we get into drafting, there may be specific uses that the community is going to want to have conversations about. So I know we need to be sensitive to that, but definitely take your comment and your idea, and we'll consider moving forward.
I'm going to add one thing to that. I think, we've been talking about concepts and ideas and things that the code evaluation has drawn out for consideration and gaps and things like that. We haven't yet drafted exactly what those are going to look like. And this forum and the surveys we put out are ways to sort of collect input on some of those ideas, but the implementing them and getting to those particulars is a future step and an imminent step. And I think the sort of spatial allocate, what are the implications of neighborhood business spatially is still, I think, something we're going to work through. And I think sort of broadly, like in a sort of blanketed way, allowing them is one approach. I think another might be to kind of try to channel them in certain areas, certain nodes. And I think there are implications for both, and they're both worth thinking about how we approach this. But those are still sort of decisions to come based on some of the feedback we get tonight and in other venues. And so just pointing that out, I think those are kind of decision points ahead for us. And as we work through these things, as we get more input on this, there'll be a chance to sort of talk through what we've done with what we've heard. But just wanted to add that as future sort of articulation of some of these ideas to come.
All right, Tim Wells, you should be able to unmute yourself right now.
Tim Wells, Munjoy Hill, thank you. One of the things about considerations when you moving, neighborhood-friendly retail in is I think looking at the height standards. Again, if you're building something for retail, I think you want to allow at least 15-foot floors on the first floor, to allow, for the MEP, all the exhaust, all the different mechanicals that are needed, the extra storage space that's needed, big windows to allow the light to enter into the space, so that people, so that retail spaces desire that space. And the worst thing we want to do is build stuff that people don't desire. And then it sits idle or, is empty a lot, and then it really hollows out the neighborhood. And so I think, some of the things that in code about the height, it's a little different now. Even on the residential above that, I think you really need to allow for at least minimum 10-foot ceilings, floor to ceiling height. And then just to deal with the STC and IIC with the impact and noise resistance, people they like to live in multifamily buildings, but they don't like to hear the family next door. And to achieve those, you need thicker floors and of course, longer spans. And so as we build residential and more multifamily, you don't have 4 areas that light comes in during the day, which really change the lighting in this inside space. So you're gonna have bigger windows, and you're gonna have, some interior apartments are only gonna have 1 wall to the exterior. Only one side that's letting lighting, and then corner windows will have 2 sides. But it's not like a house. So light doesn't transmit through the space the same way. And so you need bigger windows. And that's why you need those taller floor heights. And the other piece is that allows you, again, to do, New Height has done a wonderful job of this, of building platforms for one room. So there's storage underneath. And again, that just makes it so that those units are more livable. Like someone could move in when they're single, then they find someone they love and they bring them in to that into that unit, and then they decide and they get pregnant, and they could live there through 1 kid because it's, it allows for them to live through that period. As they have 2 kids, they got to move out probably. But, these types of things in design really matter about how friendly our housing is. And so if we allow that type of thing and we allow the proper heights and don't, like 45 feet, doesn't really work when you really get the STC levels you need. And the other thing is we got to think about the building needs to probably be at least 24 to 36 inches up in a lot of cases, because we're going to see increased flooding. We're going to have rain, 7 inches of rainfall in 2 hours. And again, I've lived in Asia. I've watched water go up 3 feet in like 30 minutes. It's unbelievable. And we're not used to that. But with global warming, we're going to start seeing that. And you don't want water pouring through your front door. And that's when we think about these things, to make our city resilient and to make us build building stock that we don't tear down in 50 years. The best thing we can do is build great buildings that last 200 or 300 years. That will save the earth, or help. Well, it won't save the earth, but it'll be a piece of it. Right? And so I hope that we really consider that. And then if you're building retail underneath, you get a little bonus for that height to allow, for the proper retail space in there, and for multi-uses, whether it's a restaurant, a coffee shop, or just a retail space,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Okay. So I think we have arrived at the end of our first session here. We've got a couple minutes before we're going to get started at 6:45, talking about the built environment. So now would be the time if anybody wants to go get a drink of water, get up, stretch your legs. Please, everybody feel free, and we will be back in 2 minutes. Okay, short break, but a good break. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm not sure if anybody new joined us. It looks like we've still got the same number of attendees, but just in case we had one or two swaps. Thanks for joining us again. Want to make it really clear that we're super appreciative of you taking your time tonight to give us some feedback and to ask us questions and really just to learn more about what we're doing here with the land use code evaluation with phase 2 of ReCode Portland. We're going to talk a little bit right now about some of the built environment focused recommendations, and we're using Slido. So you can open up a browser window if you're on your laptop or your desktop, move it to the side of this Zoom window and go to slido.com, enter in the 6-digit code here, and you're going to get plugged in to the platform to participate in all of our interactive elements that are going to be coming up. Just going to give maybe 30 seconds for people to use this QR code, maybe to write down the 6-digit code. My sense is that most people have already joined, although we've got a couple new people that it looks like just joined. We're up to 21, so that's wonderful. I would recommend that the best way to do this is to actually use your smartphone. And then that way you can have the presentation up on your screen if you're using a laptop or a desktop computer, and you can be participating in the interactive elements on your phone at the same time. If you're actually joining us from your phone, you can still do this. You can kind of multitask away from the Zoom presentation, and you'll still be able to hear us and participate in the Slido polls as well. So let's go ahead and make sure that everybody is familiar with what they're looking at once they log in here. So once you get onto Slido, this is what it's going to look like, regardless of whether or not you're on a computer or on your phone. It will look very similar. The polls tab is where all the interactive polls are going to appear. As we make things live, it's going to kind of push you into this part of the platform, give you an opportunity to answer the question or choose an option and submit it so that we can see it. And we're going to get live results to polls. If you have a question, we'd love for you to please navigate over to the Q&A tab and type it into the question box here. We're a small team, but we're going to be monitoring and trying to get to all of the questions that we can. We're also going to be covering some questions during a later period. And there will be an opportunity for you to raise your hand within the Zoom webinar and actually talk to us, give us a comment or a question verbally as well later on. We would appreciate if you would enter your name in as you're asking a question so that we can follow up with you directly if we need to. However, if you would rather ask anonymously, that is an option too, if you're more comfortable doing that, and that's fine. So there is also an option to upvote with a thumbs up or to give a thumbs down to another question. This will allow sort of the most popular questions, the questions that folks want to see answered, really kind of float to the top and get our attention. So we would encourage you to use that as well. And then if you have a comment or an idea, something that doesn't necessarily require a response as a question would, we would encourage you to go ahead and enter that type of thing into the ideas tab here. And this is going to give us a resource following the meeting here. And we're also monitoring it during the meeting to see if really interesting ideas or comments are coming through the portal. You can also give thumbs up to ideas within there too. Also want to note that text box is limited to 300 characters. So if you've got a lot of ideas, you might want to be going to the ReCode website and emailing us or leaving a comment that way. So just sort of our icebreaker here to make sure everyone has access to Slido platform. This should be a softball, but we'll see how it works out. What is Maine's state berry? Every state has a berry. I don't know what my state's berry is, but I know what your state's berry is. I think we've got 11 people responding.
We have somebody in our office from New Jersey who also like ardently argues that New Jersey's state berry, the blueberry, beats Maine state blueberry berry.
No.
No, thank you, Chris. You're an impartial third party.
That That was too much insight into
Our office.
office dynamics.
All right, so it looks like 14 people have responded here. Everybody's getting it right.
Imagine if we all learned it was the Huckleberry tonight. I mean, it would just blow everyone's mind.
Well, interestingly, and I'm not sure who among you know this, but the self-proclaimed blueberry capital of the world is a town called Cherryfield, Maine, which I think is delightfully counterintuitive. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So just to get a bead, if you've answered this already, please just go ahead and answer it again. Want to get kind of a running tally of how our audience is shifting here. If people are familiar with the comprehensive plan and the land use code, or unfamiliar, or really anywhere in between. Any answer here is okay. We're gonna kind of go through what the connections are here shortly. Wonderful. So far, no one doesn't know what I'm talking about, so that's excellent. Okay, just another couple seconds. All right, so it looks like people are within a range here. The majority is either somewhat familiar or somewhat unfamiliar, which is good. Kind of spans the gamut, right? There are some people here that are very familiar, which is also good to know. And for those people, please bear with us for a minute, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between these two things. So Portland's plan is where the policy lives, the policy side of things. So when we're talking about policy, we're talking about these are the things that the city wants to see happen. These are the things that the city has adopted as part of its vision for the future of Portland. And regulations are really the tools to implement those policies sort of at a micro level, right? So they are the rules that govern development within the city of Portland. So if we're talking about things related to the built environment, when we say the built environment, we're talking about buildings, the public realm, how things look, how things interact with each other. The city's policies are to encourage thoughtful, high quality, sustainable design, obviously first and foremost, making sure that new development is working to enhance the public realm and create vibrant public spaces for people to enjoy, strengthening tools that allow for additional growth in Portland while obviously maintaining compatible and harmonious relationships between development and existing neighborhoods. And then finally, practicing and incentivizing contextual principles of urban design that are really sort of a key part of making sure that things work together and that the health and well-being of people in Portland is a priority. And so you can see here on the regulatory side of things, we're kind of handcuffed to a set of pretty rigid ways that a land use code works, right? So a land use code thinks about things like uses and use standards. A land use code thinks about zones and how those apply throughout the city. A land use code thinks about parking, loading, access, nonconformities, and landscape provisions. So it's pretty difficult to draw a straight line from one of these policy recommendations straight to a place in the code that's going to say, boom, we implemented it. These are changes that are going to have to happen in multiple places within the regulation. Some places they will look like big changes, other places they will look like small changes. They're all going to work together, hopefully, to move us closer to the city's vision established through the policy. So what we have done here is tried to create this link through the land use code evaluation, right? So the land use code evaluation takes the policies and it looks at the regulations and it says, here's some techniques and approaches that we can use to move the regulations in the direction of achieving the policies. So when we're talking specifically about the built environment, some of those techniques and approaches might include things like dimensional and design standards that prioritize visual and physical access to the waterfront. It might be things that think about refining heights within mixed use zones, excuse me, or how dimensional standards can encourage walkability. And so there are a series of recommendations within the land use code evaluation. I'm going to walk through some of them right now briefly. So the first one that we'd like to talk about is developing dimensional and design standards to encourage both physical and visual access to the waterfront. We know that the waterfront is a key part of what makes Portland, Portland. It's a precious thing to the city of Portland, and we know that it's a working waterfront. And so to the extent that we can think about developing standards that promote public access, whether that's physical access or whether that's visual access to this very important amenity, in a way that respects the operational needs of the users and the water dependent uses that are there, is a key thing to consider moving forward. Consolidating and refining the design standards that are within the land use code. So currently there are a number of design standards within the code. Most of them live in the site plan ordinance, but they can also be found, in the use standards and the performance standards in the districts in some cases, or the zones rather. And so the idea is to consolidate them into the site plan ordinance so that we can make sure that they're aligned and that they're all working together, and simplify them to the extent that's possible to make them more objective, easier to administer. And doing that is going to make their applicability and the way that they're enforced more consistent across the city. Refining height controls in the mixed use zone. So thinking about height sort of broadly within the city of Portland, are there opportunities for us to explore what additional height might look like in the more intensive mixed use zone? So places like the B2 and the B3, thinking about what height downtown is going to be in the future. And then citywide, just taking a holistic look at the idea of height, where more height might be appropriate, how that height is achieved, and what that height looks like, both on the peninsula and also off the peninsula. Thinking about adjusting dimensional standards in the residential zones so that they better match the patterns of development that are actually on the ground and the way things that have been built in the city. So looking at refining the standards of these zones, the R3 and the R5, currently those are two zoning districts that have a pretty high level of nonconformity with the standards that are currently within the land use code. So thinking about, are there ways that we can look at minimum lot sizes, setbacks, frontage requirements, and really match those up to the way that things have been built in these neighborhoods, allowing for a continuation of those traditional patterns that we're seeing, the things that people really love about Portland neighborhoods. How can we actually make sure that the regulations reflect those things? And then finally, exploring additional standards to make sure that as new things come into these neighborhoods, as new development is coming in, that it occurs in a way that actually respects that established character, that developed character. Adjusting dimensional standards to make sure that we're encouraging a more walkable environment. So thinking about relationship of buildings to the streets, particularly as it relates to even more auto-oriented zones, right? So the B4 zone, let's not give the B4 zone away to auto-oriented development. Let's think about ways that we can make it more walkable, that we can make it more pedestrian-oriented, and apply standards across the city that we know work to make a more comfortable pedestrian and bicycle environment for people. And then integrating elements of the PAD, the Pedestrian Activities District, into the base zoning where it makes sense. So the PAD currently has a series of standards that apply within the B4 zone that require a certain percentage of active uses. B3 zone, I think I said B4. B3 zone that requires a certain percentage of active uses on the ground floor. So this is a concept that might make sense in places other than just the B3. So thinking about, are there opportunities for us to kind of take what's working in the pedestrian activities district and just build that into the base zone so that it's not working as an overlay, but it's essentially, we're saying that we want this where we want it, and it's not anything kind of special. All right, so we've just gone through 6, and what we're hoping to get is a little bit of feedback here in terms of what you all on the call tonight think are the most important. So if you could go through, please, and just select, click 1, 2, 3, and that's going to tell us what you think is most important, second most, and third most important, just to kind of get an idea of where everybody on the call is with regard to these recommendations. I'm going to give us about a minute. I'm hesitant to speak too soon, but it looks like walkability and the pedestrian activities district standards are kind of coming out in front here. And then ensuring visual and physical access to the waterfront is a key thing for folks as well. Whoops, I messed it up. Okay, we're back. I scrolled, you can't scroll. Thanks everybody for bearing with. Okay, so it looks like we're sitting at about 14 responses, which is hasn't changed for a little bit here. So I think we'll go ahead and move on and contrast those with what were as of yesterday evening, the top responses on the survey elements related to the built environment that people can access through the ReCode Portland website. And those, what you're seeing here indicates levels of support on a scale of 1 to 5. So the lighter blue color represents a 1, or what would be a 1. And then the darkest blue color represents what would be a 5. And so what you can see here is that there's sort of a broad level of support for all of these recommendations, all of these initiatives. Some of them garner more stronger support than others. And it looks like that the top 3 so far are adjusting dimensional standards to ensure a more walkable environment, kind of consistent with what we've heard tonight. Making sure that access to the waterfront is prioritized again, similar to what we've heard tonight. And then thinking about refining height controls in mixed use zones. That one is also one that seems to have generated a little bit more conversation, right? So there both is a lot of support at the high level, but then there's also a little bit of a bump in terms of the level of people that aren't so sure about refining the height control. So that's also good for us to know where there's maybe a little bit of trepidation and that we need to work to make sure that as we're implementing these things and developing the actual code language, that we're cognizant of where those conversations are happening within the community. Okay, and so with that, we just presented a whole bunch of ideas and kind of got your feedback on our ideas, and now we're wondering if you have any of your own. So can you think of anything that we've left out in terms of a tool or a technique that might help to implement the city's policy goals related to the built environment? So anything that would really relate to the form of buildings, the way that buildings relate to each other, the way that buildings relate to the street design of buildings, those types of recommendations. Happy to give everyone a minute here to filter in some ideas. Form-based standards, absolutely. Thinking about reducing setbacks. Seems like there's support for form-based elements here, so that's good. Only allow extra height for buildings with affordable units. No opt-out. Stairwell to 6 stories. Okay. More transparency on zoning questions for the public to avoid planning hearings. These are all really good. We've had about a minute here. So I would encourage people, if you have more to say, to go ahead and put these in on the ideas tab. Those will be logged for us so that your ideas will definitely be taken into consideration as we move forward here. And we're going to go ahead and move right on to the next part here, which is starting to get into some questions and answers. So our team here has kind of flagged a number of questions for us to talk about. So I'm going to try and go through these. Hopefully I can answer them all. If not, I have got a resource of my colleagues here. So is it possible to create zones that encourage row houses using maximum lot sizes and minimum side setbacks, or arcades with negative setbacks for upper floors. I think I saw that this one had been answered.
Yeah, that was me, Chris.
Go ahead.
So I'll just chime in here. The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is, we're looking at everything that is happening in Portland, including row house type developments, architectural features such as arcades. So, we don't have any specifics on how this would kind of play out as part of ReCode, but we've done a lot of work looking at row house development of various forms, and there are ways to really facilitate and encourage that type of development. And a lot of times it's really just making the standards applicable for row houses because they are such a unique development form. Same thing with arcades and arcades with negative setbacks for upper floors. As we look at things like build to zones, which is a type of form-based control that can be built in, you can look at things and how that plays together. So right now I don't have an answer that this would be part of the Portland ReCode process, but it is something that we do have in mind and we'll look at.
Great, thanks, Arista. So it looks like one of the questions that came in was, will setbacks be looked at as part of ReCode? Absolutely. We will absolutely be looking at setbacks to see where we think that they're working, where they could be working better, and what changes we may need to make to facilitate, obviously, the implementation of the city's policy goals. So yes, we'll be looking at setbacks. There are many 50-foot wide lots on Peaks Island. 20-foot side setbacks are a major impediment to creating small, affordable ADUs. Can setbacks be reduced? So we know that the islands are kind of a very unique. They're a unique place, both in Portland and outside of Portland, and that there are considerations that we need to be aware of specifically to the way that development happens on the island, the way that we need to be sensitive to it. I can't necessarily provide an answer right now in terms of if it makes sense to reduce the setbacks. We would need to do some analysis to determine whether that might make sense. But I think it's something that we will definitely consider moving forward. As we just talked about in the previous question, setbacks are on the table. So if setbacks are on the table, they're on the table everywhere. So we'll be taking a look at those. Are there plans to allow residential development on unaccepted streets? I personally don't have any plans. I'm wondering if anybody from the city knows or can say anything about this idea of accepting or allowing residential development on unaccepted streets.
That's a tricky one. One of the ways you can develop somewhere is having one of the factors is having frontage on a public city street. It's like a core threshold question. And so getting to development on unaccepted streets, is tricky in the sense of what the status is on unaccepted streets. In this case, I think it implies non-public streets. So it takes some major changes. It's an interesting topic. I don't have a neat answer, except that as of now, that would be hard to do, but it's worth thinking about. Are there any other approaches to what we consider, a buildable lot? Right now, I think that it wouldn't qualify, but we can certainly add it into the pool of things to think about as far as potential housing development, things like that.
Yeah, I will add that, this has been a topic of conversation for a long time, the old provisions known as 14403, right, which require that you need to be on an accepted city street. One of the ways that we've thought about sort of, we want to open up undeveloped lots to housing creation, right? Like that's a goal citywide. And so is there a way to modify the street standards, right, in our technical manual, which require the street be a certain width or have a certain, be built to a certain standard before a lot is developed? I think that's another place that we've thought about sort of getting to this, getting to the goal of opening up more lots for development without necessarily removing the requirement that you be on a accepted city street with city services. Food for thought.
Thanks, you guys. Okay, and then it looks like our last one here is, can some parts of the city be closed to traffic and pedestrian only year round. So many great examples in Europe. I agree about many great examples in Europe. That's something I think that's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about here with the land use code in terms of the regulatory environment. That's typically something that's handled differently through, well, I don't know how specifically it would be handled by Port.
Yeah, I can jump in, Chris.
Sure.
I mean, I think, again, this may get to street standards, right? We have a number of developments that have come through in the last 5 years, 10 years that have done sort of shared street design that is sort of moving more in this direction, right? Not prohibiting traffic outright, but making streets that, or, you know, private ways generally, or sometimes public, that are more sort of oriented towards shared space between vehicles and pedestrians and bikes, et cetera. And so I think it's to some extent, it's a matter of street design, and to some extent, it's a matter of policy, right? Obviously, during the pandemic, there were streets in the Old Port that were close to traffic, and some of those have worked really well, but that was a matter of a sort of a different set of regulations and policies.
Right. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and move on. So if you would like to do it the old fashioned way and talk to us, ask us a question, now's the time to go ahead in the Zoom panel underneath where you're looking at my presentation here, you'll see a little raise hand icon. So if you'd like to talk to us and ask your question or make a comment that way, now's the time.
Great. And we have Zach Borowitz. And Zach, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Oh, how convenient. I had forgotten to lower my hand.
Oh, can you come up with a question fast?
Well, sure. I guess there's a comment. You know, the ADUs on Peaks Island. Peaks Island's winter population is like 800 people or something. And, you know, it's hard to say what the summer population, but on any given day, there could be 3,000 people there. So adding 50 units, 100 units to the winter population really would be, you know, negligible when you consider how much it balloons in the summertime. Thanks.
Zach, just you don't have to reply. We'll take that comment, but I do have a follow-up question if you're able, or just to clarify, you mean it would not be worthwhile to add 100 units because it's too little, or something else, and you don't have to follow up, but if you could clarify, that'd be great.
Oh no, yeah, I think 100 units would be aspirational. But yes, I think it would be worthwhile, and I don't think it would, you know, have any sort of an impact. So yeah, so relaxing that those setbacks would be beneficial.
Great, thank you.
Right now, we don't have anybody else's hand up. So if you'd like to ask a question live right now, again, the raise hand feature is at the bottom of your screen, and go ahead and do so, and I'll call on you. Great, a couple of people just popped in. Maggie Wolf, I'm going to unmute you or allow you to talk now, so you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, Maggie Wolf. I live at 28 St. Lawrence Street. This may not be I know I've attended all the sessions that you know, this has been very interesting, and I hope there's ways to get more people involved, you know, and sorry, it's only 18 or 20 or whatever of us. And so this question might not be part of this session, but just in general, how can we incentivize year-round? Zach's question made me think of this: year-round housing versus vacation housing, and obviously more affordable housing goes along with that. But you know, we just don't want to have any old thing built. We need housing. We need housing for people who work here. So I guess I'm just wondering, before we open up and change all the zoning and get massive development for summer people or vacation rentals or whatever, what can we do to really focus the development, you know, these new heights or whatever we're going to do for people who are going to be living and working in Portland? Thank you.
That's a good question, Maggie. It's also a very difficult question. to answer sort of in the context of the land use code. And the reason that it's a difficult question to answer is because the land use code doesn't specifically deal with who is ultimately going to be occupying these units, right? So we can speak to sort of the physical location of units. We can speak to the number of units that are allowed to be built. We can speak to the design of the buildings, right? We can speak to density, but we can't necessarily speak to how those units are ultimately, marketed and sold once they hit the market. And I understand that this is a concern, and it's a concern in a lot of places, because you want to make sure that housing that's being built in Portland is being built for Portlanders. And I think that, there may be sort of a variety of tools that are adjunct to the land use code that can start to, sort of get at those types of things. But unfortunately, I mean, I'm not coming up with anything on the fly here in terms of a regulatory tool that can really get at the issue of home ownership being for Portlanders versus things that are built and marketed as vacation destination homes.
Yeah. Megan, your hand is back up, so I'm going to allow you to talk again because it sounds like you may have a follow-up. I will just add that there are regulations in the land use code that do incentivize and require affordable housing development. So on that point, right, there are tools within our existing code that we're looking at augmenting to make sure that some proportion of the housing that's built here is affordable and remains affordable to folks moving forward.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay, yeah, so just quickly, I understand it's not part of the land use, but to encourage a parallel path to deploy some of those other tools at the same time, so that when the code is modified to promote more building, that we have those other tools in place. And I'm thinking, for example, of higher property taxes on people who are not living in those buildings, for example. I'm sure there's lots of other ones. And I understand this is not unique to Portland. That, I just read about Spokane. You probably all saw that article in the New York Times or something. Cities all over the country are having the same issue, housing crisis. Everybody's moving to them. Prices are unaffordable. So maybe we can borrow or, look at and I guess that's what you're already doing, is looking what other cities are doing. But it's just the risk of a destination city like Portland that we get more, condos that are dark in the winter and things like that. That's not what we need. That's not the problem we're trying to solve here. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Okay, Tim Wells, you are up.
So a few things. Obviously, we would like to have people who reside in Portland live in new units. That'd be great, but I just encourage people to think long-term versus short-term, because just demographics and behaviors change. And so what's important is to build the right housing stock. And then, a 70-year-old couple might move in and buy it, and they might live there for 7 or 8 years before they, pass on, or before they decide to go to a home or decide they want something else. But over time, as our economy grows and we get a deeper and wider economy, where there's a lot more people working different types of jobs here, and higher income jobs, you're going to get more people moving into them that are living here. And so it's patience. What is happening right now doesn't mean that's the way it's always going to be. And so what's important is that we build the right stock so that it that again can last the test of time. And uses will change, and as jobs grow, we will start to see more and more people who reside in our community live there. And so let's not have I hope we can not have a short-term viewpoint on that. The other piece is, sometimes I worry about wording, about maintaining the contextuality of a neighborhood, again, because it's a hard thing, right? Because again, demographics are changing, needs are changing. a triple decker on One Joy Hill again might have had 30 people in it. Because each family had 7 kids and 2 grandparents and the kid, it's because of the multi-generational living. And two couple things. I think one, we're probably some multi-generational living is going to come back to the United States. But I also think that, again, allowing more units, because the number of people living per household has just decreased so much. If we're going to build neighborhood centers, you need enough density to support those businesses or they can't survive. And when you don't have 10 people per unit anymore, you need more units. It's just the way it is. It's unfortunate, but we can't fight it. We don't have the capability to change that. And so we have to roll with it. And so that really, there's ways to keep a feel of a neighborhood, but change the dimensional standards. And that's the crux, right? And use land better, again, to protect our environment, et cetera, et cetera. But we always have to, it's a numbers game. When you look at the thing about mass transit, this 8 units per acre is nonsense. It's like 40. If you're going to support, public transit, it's not the same as it used to be. That number is so outdated. You can run the numbers. It's easy to do the math. And we have to think through that.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.
Yeah. Oh, well, can I ask one more thing?
Sure,
Sorry.
of course.
I'm being verbose. I apologize.
That's okay.
The one thing I wanted to get your opinion on, though, is and I know it's a tough thing to reconcile, but the single family, the single staircase like Europe does. And it's tested. Germany allows 8 stories with 1 staircase, and they don't have problems with fire.
Yeah.
We're just over concerned about something that happens once in a million times.
Yeah.
The statistics just don't support that, and this changes. It adds so much cost to a building. It takes out so many units. It changes the design so much.
Yeah.
It would be, I don't know what the right height is. I don't know if it's 6 stories, 8 stories, 5 stories, 4 stories, but it would make a big difference and would reduce the cost per unit.
Yeah. And we hear this a lot, right? This is a building code issue for folks who are not familiar with it. It's a building code issue, a fire code, life safety code issue. And we hear a lot about it. So I think that change is a change outside the land use code, but is one that is interesting to think about how to pursue, because I think it would open up options for design and for density in new ways that are worth really thinking about. So thanks for your comments, Tim. And I hope we have time for one more. There's Sherry, you've been patiently waiting to talk, and you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, thank you for putting on these sessions. It's been really interesting. I keep hearing more and more about increasing as much housing as we can and opening up as much land as possible for development. And I would like to hear a little bit more about, in conjunction with that, the plans for the green space that is going to be left. In a lot of the neighborhoods, the setbacks are really used as the green space. And I think when you're planning on coming into some of these older neighborhoods where we've chosen not to build out our lots completely, those are the areas where the neighborhood children play, and that there's some land left for rewilding. And I would just hate to see the attempt to homogenize the entire city, because I feel like that people are different and enjoy different parts of the city differently. And so I really feel like you should consider that before you go into existing areas and start to conform the setbacks to something about high density. Thank you.
Thanks. And absolutely take that comment. And we're definitely not proposing density to a level that would mean open space kind of takes on a completely different character in neighborhoods. I think, one thing that we're considering is sort of the nature of open space, right, and how people use it, because for sure there's definitely a place for people's front yards to, as a place, if you have a single family home and that's what you want and that's what you enjoy, you want to have a front yard and you want to have that space to enjoy. As we're talking about providing options in other places in the community, open space can take on a different form, right? It can be more of sort of a common open space or a public open space. And, that's a key thing within Portland's plan, as well as making sure that there's a system of connected open space that's accessible, that's usable for residents. And one of the things that we're definitely taking into account, particularly around the conversation with density, is making sure that density doesn't ever reach a point where it becomes overwhelming. I mean, Portland is still going to be Portland, and open space and preservation of the natural environment is always going to be a priority for the city. So I just want to make clear that that's something that we're thinking about with every step that we take in terms of thinking of density, and we're going to be taking steps to make sure that we're preserving open space, and that we're making sure that moving forward, even as things potentially get denser, that open space is prioritized for residents of the city. Okay.
I'll just add, that was, I totally agree with all that, but I think as we talk through these issues, just for emphasis, I'll add that we, I think, never think of the city as a monolith. Yes, we're thinking about open space and different densities, but not uniformly, sort of with a blunt brush or broad brush, applying the same standard everywhere. I think that a range of types of places and characters are important. I think we know that, and we hear it from the community a lot. Even from community members who absolutely think we should have more density and more intensity in some areas, but that those distinctions matter, and we'll keep that distinctions as in that different parts of the city should feel different and have different histories and will look different, have different sort of levels of intensity. And I think that will be important part of considerations as we move through this coding process.
Thanks, Christine. So we are almost exactly at 7:30. So I think we can just kind of transition right into the next session here. We'll skip over our little break. So if anyone has joined us, I'm not sure if we have any new attendees. It'd be nice if there was a way to track that. Thanks for joining us. This session is designed as a way for you all to provide feedback to us, to ask us your questions, and to learn more about the recommendations that are coming out of the land use code evaluation, which is part of phase 2 of ReCode. So for the next 40 to 45 minutes, we're going to be talking specifically about economic development focused regulations. So if you haven't joined us already, would encourage everybody to please open up a browser window and go to slido.com. You can do this either on your computer, just move it to the side of the Zoom window, type in slido.com and put in the 6-digit code. Or you can do it on your smartphone. So scanning the QR code or typing it in a browser window on your smartphone. I would recommend doing it that way. And then that way you're not competing for screen space between our lovely presentation and answering the questions. So we'll give everyone just a few seconds here. My sense is that that everyone has already joined, but just want to make sure that we're being fair in case there are any people that just joined us. Okay. So if you did just join us, what you're going to see when you log in is an interface that looks like this, very similar on both your computer and on your smartphone. There's a tab for polls, which is where all of the interactive polling is going to appear. There's also a tab for questions and answers. This is where we would encourage you to please enter your questions in as they come up while we're talking here. We encourage you to please put your name in as you're asking a question. If you're comfortable, that just enables us to kind of follow up if we need to. Although if you're more comfortable asking anonymously, it's also an option here. You can give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to questions if you want to see them answered. The ones that get the most thumbs up will automatically float up to the top and be addressed first. There's also going to be an opportunity at the end of our session here for people to raise their hands in the Zoom window and be called on to actually ask us a question verbally. And then as we're moving through the presentation, if you have ideas, if you have reactions to things as we're going through and we're talking about them, encourage you to put those in here as long as they're ideas, things that don't necessarily need a response. We would encourage questions to go in the questions comments, or the questions tab, comments, and ideas to go in the ideas tab. And please note that these are limited to 300 characters. So if you want to tell us more than that, you're going to have to go to the ReCode website and contact us through there. Similar to the questions, these can also take thumbs up so that we have an idea of the sentiment of people who are in attendance here to those ideas. So to make sure that everyone has joined us through the Slido, an interesting piece of trivia here. In 2009, Portlanders gained international recognition for creating what was at the time the world's largest lobster roll. How big was it? I think these are all obscenely large options. Apparently they made it on Commercial Street, middle of the street.
How did we miss this? I never heard anything about this.
Really?
I am learning a lot tonight.
Yes. Stopping traffic.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like 13 people have made a guess here. 14 people. Give a couple more seconds for people to respond. I know everyone is wanting to know what the answer is. And the answer is it was 61 feet long. And that was in 2009. And interestingly, in case anyone is interested, and I find it interesting, the record is now up to about 150 feet. In the intervening years, there have been Canadian teams that have waded into this battle, and 150 feet was actually achieved in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, although it is contested because they assembled it in 5-foot pieces as opposed to 100 sub sandwich. So there we go. Okay. We've done this a couple times already. If you have already answered it, apologies for making you answer it again. If you've just joined us, just trying to get an idea for how many people here are familiar with the code and their level of familiarity with both the comprehensive plan and the land use code. So just give a couple seconds to make sure everyone who wants to answer can have the opportunity to do that. Okay, so I'm going to move on. It looks like we've got roughly the same sort of dynamic that we've had. Most people are, somewhere between somewhat unfamiliar and very familiar, which is good. We don't have anyone that's completely unfamiliar. So policy and regulations. Policy is what comes out of Portland's Plan 2030. So these are the long-term goals that the city has adopted as part of its vision for the future across that planning horizon, right, culminating in 2030. Regulations are the tools and the techniques that ultimately serve to implement that policy in the way that development happens within the city. So as we're talking about key economic development policies coming out of the city's comprehensive plan, those are things like making sure that the city values innovation and creativity, making sure that the city is economically prosperous by providing opportunities to grow the tax and employment base. Reinforcing, of course, the waterfront as a key component of Portland's economic health, and then investing in attracting and retaining sort of the human element of economic development, right? Human capital, and supporting a growing economy by allowing people to move to Portland. And then valuing and nurturing Portland-based local businesses. So we've talked a little bit about in the previous sessions, it's difficult to kind of take the language that you're seeing on the policy side of things and directly connect that to one or two things that you would adjust in the regulations that you could say, hey, I'm achieving this goal of valuing innovation and creativity because I changed a setback. So it's difficult to make those connections. One thing that we're hoping to do here with the land use code evaluation is to bridge that gap. So to really make the connections between key policy elements that are coming out of Portland's planning documents and changes that are going to be proposed for Portland's regulatory document, the land use code. And so in terms of economic development, some of the things that you're going to be seeing recommended in the land use code evaluation are things like adding creative uses to the list of permitted uses, revising the definition of agriculture so that it's open to more and more modern types of agricultural activities, thinking about potential revisions to the city's office and low impact industrial zones. So I'm just going to talk about these in a little bit more detail one by one here. So one of the recommendations is to add pockets of mixed use zoning to neighborhoods. So we talked about this in the previous session on complete neighborhoods. And essentially this is providing opportunities for local businesses within local business districts and neighborhoods. So thinking about parcels that have historically provided these types of opportunities for smaller businesses within a neighborhood. So these could be the corner store, the mom and pop grocer, those types of businesses that sort of fit seamlessly into neighborhood context and neighborhood character. Low impact, useful to the people that live there, and predominantly marketed to the people that live within close proximity to them. Adding neighborhood scale retail to residential zoning, again, getting at this idea of providing more opportunities for low impact, sort of small neighborhood scale commercial uses to open up, providing an avenue to entrepreneurship for people within neighborhoods, and thinking about how we can expand access to those types of opportunities within the city's residential zones. Adding creative uses, some newer creative uses to the list of the city's permitted uses. So talked about this a little bit, right? In terms of thinking about things that are kind of currently considered low impact industrial uses, but that might actually be more suitable for different areas of the city than you would typically allow a low impact industrial use in. So things like micro production of alcohol, microbreweries. People in Portland like beer. I know that to be a fact. Maker spaces, businesses that repair or recycle consumer goods, specialty food services like coffee roasters, candy makers, these types of places that can fit in a broader context than something that would just be considered a low impact industrial use. Pulling these out allows us to allow them to happen more broadly throughout the city. As I mentioned, revising the definition of agriculture to include more modern urban agricultural activities. It's a pretty narrowly defined, I think Mel said yesterday very well, it's kind of a rural definition of agriculture that's currently applying to what is an urban context in the city of Portland. So how can we revise this definition to make sure that it's acknowledging that context and it's providing opportunities that are appropriate to that context? So looking at urban agricultural activities as part of that definition, and opening and expanding the ability for people within the city to pursue these types of things. Encouraging transit-oriented mixed-use development along transit corridors, allowing additional density in terms of residential density, more density than is currently permitted, right? Additional height and requiring pedestrian-oriented design to support the co-location of jobs and housing, right? So this whole idea that where people are living, there's also more economic opportunity for businesses to open up. By supporting the density, you're also supporting business opportunity. Revising the city's office zones. So currently the city has two sort of office oriented zones, the RP and the OP, excuse me. So the intent behind this recommendation is really to clarify the purpose of these zones, right? The RP seems to be kind of a traditional transitional zone that's really kind of bridging the gap between a residential district and something that's a low intensity kind of office district. And it even leans on the residential districts for things like its dimensional standards. The OP is more of a kind of traditional office park style development. And so what we're recommending is just taking a look at these, seeing if the intent of these zones still makes sense for the city of Portland. If there are ways that we can revise them to allow kind of newer uses that could support the workers during the day, for instance, into these zones, but also being open to the idea that in certain cases, maybe the best alternative is to move away from one of these sort of single use office zones and towards something more like a mixed use zone. And then refining the low impact industrial zones. So making sure that the uses that are permitted within the low impact industrial zone really align with the identity of those places as low impact within the city. Making sure that there are opportunities, again, people are working in these places, people are driving in here every day. Are they able to access goods and services that they need while they're at work? Do they have a place to drop off their dry cleaning? Do they have a place to go and get lunch? Those types of things, bringing in some more modern uses into the low impact industrial zones. And in the same vein, making sure that while you're opening it up a little, you're not opening it up too much, right? This is industrial land. We want to allow for an increase in the way that these work for the people that are going to them every day, but we don't necessarily want to harm the functional needs of the real industrial users that are within these areas. And then recognizing the potential for emerging industries in the waterfront. So we know that maintaining the unique orientation of each of the city's 3 waterfront zones is a very critical thing here. And preserving the way that they function is also a very critical thing. What we have heard is that there's also opportunity and that we should really consider recognizing the potential for emerging industries to fit in and to complement that orientation while still preserving the function. So we're not recommending large scale changes to anything within the city's waterfront zones, but what we're suggesting is that there may be opportunity for flexibility as new uses, as new innovative or unique uses emerge, that they may fit into the waterfront context and that we need to be prepared for that. So I want to open it up to everyone who is still here. We have just talked about these 7 recommendations. Please let us know which you think are the 3 most important. You can do that by just clicking 1, 2, 3, and what you're looking at here will auto update as people vote. I give everybody about a minute to do this. Okay. So with 11 votes that came in, looks like the number 1 priority for people that are here are adding pockets of mixed use to neighborhoods. 12 votes stayed the same, that's good. Adding creative uses to the list of permitted uses, and then encouraging transit-oriented development along corridors. Worth noting that they're all pretty close here. So it seems like that there's a level of support that's notable for each one of these. Thanks everyone for voting. Just to point out, if there are any differences between the results that have come in so far related to the economic development survey element that's available on ReCode, looks like we're in general agreement in terms of levels of support for these initiatives. If you haven't been here from my previous explanations, what we're looking at here is results of the survey So people were asked to assess their level of support for the recommendations on a scale of 1 to 5. And so if someone answered 1, you're seeing it in that light blue color. And if someone answered 5, you're seeing it in the darkest blue color. I am colorblind, so I hope these are all blue and I'm not confusing anyone. I think they're all blue. And so what we can see is that there is sort of broad support for each one of these recommendations, right? And it looks like the top 3 for everyone who has responded online are pretty consistent with what we're seeing here: encouraging transit-oriented development, adding neighborhood scale retail, thinking about allowing for pockets of mixed use. So that is good for us to know. Related to the economic development policy goals, as well as the recommendations that we've just talked about, is there anything that you all here on the session tonight think that we've missed that we should consider as we move forward? A tool or technique that you think can move us closer toward achieving the city's economic development goals? And again, I will open it up for about a minute. Get to work, start digging. More dense housing as a tool for economic development. So it looks like some people are suggesting different forms of retail or very small shop space that could be rented out. Thinking about new uses along the western waterfront. And then, a number of comments connecting availability of housing as an economic development priority. Okay. So thank you, everyone. If you have more to add to these, or if you have additional ideas or comments, please leave those for us in the ideas tab on Slido. You can go right over there and leave us a comment there that we will log and read as part of this process as well. So thank you. Okay. Looks like we have got a few questions. The first one, are there any plans to expand the livestock that people are allowed to have, such as goats, turkeys, geese, or pigs? That is not something I believe that we addressed through the land use code evaluation, but I'm not sure if anybody, any of our colleagues at the city can speak to plans to expand people's ability to keep livestock.
Wow, this is testing my knowledge of the code. I think that some of these regs are in other chapters of the code, Christine or Matt, you may be able to help on that. But obviously the definition of agriculture sort of hits on some of this topic, right? Or some of what you're getting at. And so, again, certainly we're looking at that definition and thinking about ways to make it possible for folks to do creative things around agriculture, urban agriculture, and growing food sort of citywide.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, and I think that that's probably the most direct connection, is thinking about expanding the range of what's considered urban agriculture to include potentially things like keeping of animals, animal husbandry, those types of uses. Okay, is there any way? Yes, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, read the questions. Got ahead of myself.
Is there any way that office zones can be allowed to easily be converted to housing in existing buildings? Arista, do you have thoughts about this?
Yes, I responded to both of these questions because essentially both these questions are asking the same thing.
Yeah.
So from a land use code, we've been getting this a lot. Chris and I we're both from Camiris, and we've been getting this question a lot, in particular because of these, where you see this kind of glut of office space happening in different cities. From from a zoning perspective or a land use code perspective, you can look at the mix of uses you allow in districts. You can look at the dimensional standards that are applied in those districts so that you can facilitate these conversions. There is the other aspect, which I think both these questions might be getting at, in terms of what the building code defines as commercial space versus residential space. And that's outside the purview of what we're doing. And it's something kind of a bigger issue that will need to be tackled in a lot of places because, you know, as many of you are probably aware, there's very specific regulations for residential and building code, and then some specific ones for office. I mean, and so creating that easy conversion is kind of something out of the bounds of what we're talking about tonight.
Thanks, Arista. Okay. So those being the questions that came in through the question portal, I think now is a good time to move on and see if anybody wants to raise their hand and give us some feedback, a comment, or ask us a question. The way to do that would be to navigate over to the Zoom window. So underneath my presentation here that you're seeing, there's a little button that says raise hand. If you do that, we'll be able to see that you raised your hand and we'll call on you to unmute. Now we'll call on you to unmute.
Great. We have a couple of hands raised. So I'm going to go to Todd first. Todd, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, Todd Morse again from East Bayside. I have one quick comment and then one question. The comment I wanted to make is just stress the importance of dense housing for economic development. I think people are the most valuable resource we have, both economically and also just they contribute to their community. Almost everyone, I think, is a net gain to at least someone in their community. And if we don't build housing, then people will kind of be pushed out and the benefits of the economic development will go to the few. And we've been used to not building housing for so long, people just kind of assume that will always happen, but I don't think it has to. And then the question I had was in terms of pockets of mixed use zones, how would that process go? So like, for example, would you decide in advance where you would want new shops to open up? Or as a shop owner, would I petition the city to get a pocket open? I'm just concerned that that might add some friction to opening up new shops in those mixed use zones.
Yeah, so I think it could, oh, did somebody else say something? Okay, I think it could happen in a variety of ways, right? So this is, I mean, obviously if it's a zoning district, anybody could always apply for a rezoning, right? So if I have a piece of property that I think would be suitable in a neighborhood for a corner store, I can apply for a rezoning. The city could also be more proactive in terms of taking its policy and working to identify areas that the city thinks might be appropriate for these types of things and sort of proactively working to rezone. Those would be the two ways ultimately that it could manifest itself as a rezoning change. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
I think that was great. Yeah. All right. Next we have Brenton Dupee. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Brenton from East Bayside. During the polls, I saw a lot of questions about revising or refining things like height limits or industrial uses. I was wondering what you meant by those. I'm more in favor of lax rules, but just from the wording of the question, I didn't know if that meant, you know, stricter or looser. Thanks.
I think it depends. You know, we don't, I guess the short answer is we don't necessarily know right now. My sense is that in most cases, we would be talking about expanding or, you know, being more permissive with things like height where it might make sense. As we're having conversations about density, as we're having conversations about people wanting to build more housing, for instance, within the city, the conversations are going to have to be, you know, necessarily about more versus less. So I don't think sort of off the bat, we would be proposing to sort of, you know, narrow down the heights that are permitted and the uses that are permitted. You can see if you've read through the land use code, most times when we're saying revise in sort of the context of take a look at opening these up, take a look at adding more in. Once we get into the drafting process, I think we'll have a more detailed conversation about exactly how that manifests and how that looks. But the posture I think that we're taking through the land use code evaluation is this needs to be a process that's kind of prioritizing achieving the city's goals through adding flexibility into the land use code.
Yeah, and anybody who has followed the ReCode process through phase 1 knows that we took a long list of uses that existed in the city's old code and consolidated a number of them through the phase 1 of this ReCode work in an effort to sort of simplify the code more broadly. And so generally the trend has been through phase 1 and will be through phase 2 to sort of simplify uses where possible as a way of sort of adding flexibility and room for innovation and creativity. So Tim Wells, again, we're glad to hear from you. I'm going to allow you to talk. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, real quick, thank you. Yeah, it'd be great to get rid of the office zones because, I mean, obviously they're very sterile, one day part type community, or they're not communities, they're just areas. And so that'd be wonderful if we could get, mixed use into those areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. I'm not seeing any more hands now. But if folks would like to raise hands and ask a question, now's the time. Great, Tim McNamara, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hey there, thank you, great forum. My question would be, how might the land use code be modified to encourage institutions such as the universities or the hospitals to provide a housing component as they move forward with their seemingly constant expansion and development?
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim, right? And very near and dear to work that you and I have been doing around Maine Med for a long time, right? I think we developed the institutional overlays zoning, as you know, as a tool to sort of allow both hospitals and other large institutions and the city to sort of project out around institutional needs and develop zoning that suits those projections, both from the city side, the neighborhood side, and the institution side. And I think, thinking about institutional interactions with neighborhoods and ways that they can be mutually beneficial is sort of a cornerstone of that zoning policy. And I think sort of time will tell how it plays out with other institutions, but I think it's a great comment, right? We want to make sure that those relationships are mutually supportive. And in places where, and we know that housing is a need across the city, we should be thinking about how to leverage those zoning tools to make sure that that's happening wherever we can make it happen.
For sure. Thanks again for this format. Great way to approach this.
Thank you.
All right, would anybody else like to ask a question here? Speak now or forever hold your peace. I should say, you're always welcome to reach out to us by any means necessary. You can find us at recodeportland.me or reach out to any of us individually by email or by phone, of course. Back to you, Chris.
Looks like we got Zach just raised his hand.
Sorry, Zach, I apologize. You should be able to unmute yourself, Zach.
Oh, never mind. I was just going to ask a cranky question about parking.
Go for it.
Yeah, you should ask it. Go for it.
What role does structured parking play in economic development?
That's a pretty broad question. And I'm not sure how to really begin answering it in a clean way. Structured parking, I mean, I'm a little bit stumped here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we recognize that, the city has revised in ReCode phase 1, right? We've revised parking requirements to open up the sort of field around parking. And you know, Zach, that in the code evaluation, we talk about looking at parking maximums, right, as a way to sort of flip the switch on parking, right, and try to get folks to be smarter about the way that they're thinking about parking and actually limit what has been historically an oversupply of parking in some parts of the city. But I think that ultimately, parking is still part of what we see a lot of developers wanting to build. And so, I think, again, the question about parking maximums is totally live and is something that we'll look at through this phase 2 process. But I think that there's demand for parking still. And so we need to think about how to sort of wean ourselves off it, but it's going to be part of our sort of urban environment for a while.
Yeah.
And that may not be a satisfying response, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, after a second to think about it, I think you're right now. It's, a lot of communities that we work in are in sort of this nebulous space where we're adding flexibilities around the parking that's required, but there are still, from a business perspective, employers that want to come in and build parking. And so, like everything that we do, right, it has to be achieving a balance to make sure that it's working for everybody involved. And I think that, the thing is, as we're thinking about moving toward things like maximums, that we're also thinking about sort of what that structured parking manifests as, right, in the way that it's designed and the way that it sits in the urban environment, whether or not it's able to be reused or repurposed, and adding flexibility around it. But I do think, kind of to back up what you said, that it's definitely still part of the conversation. We understand that there's a distinct kind of cultural shift that is ongoing and occurring about requiring parking and moving away from it, but it's still part of the conversation for sure.
Eric Anderson, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Super, thanks. Eric Anderson from the Libbytown neighborhood. And I'm sort of a newbie to the ReCode stuff. And I was just wondering if you could give us an overview of sort of the timeline and process ahead of us for ReCode, and when we would expect actual recommendations to be put on paper and enacted. Thanks.
Sure. So I don't have the timeline pulled up in front of me. I think we've kind of shifted a little bit. But I think within the near term here, we're going to be taking the feedback that we've received on the land use code evaluation and working kind of internally to prioritize what's going to be drafted first. And we're going to actually move into a period of taking what you see in terms of these recommendations and drafting some code language. That will be available for public review before anything kind of moves into an adoption process. So that's going to be available for public review and comment. It'll be taken back and revised. And I think we're still working through exactly what that process looks like in terms of the public engagement around those specific pieces of draft code language. But the intent is to publish things sort of as they're ready and continue the conversation around specific pieces moving forward. I don't know if anybody from the city wants to elaborate on that.
I know Nell just mentioned the website, but I would just add ReCodePortland.me. We will continue to update it with next steps, new events, and you can contact us there through the site too. There'll be ways to reach us if anyone has questions on process or next products. So the website's a great resource.
Okay. Not seeing any more hands raised. And we have arrived at 8:05. So I think maybe we give another minute in case anybody has a last minute question. And otherwise, I think we will say thank you so much for your time again tonight. Thanks for bearing with us for 2 hours. And if you were here last night, thanks for doing it for 4. We really appreciate you taking the time to let us know what you think.
Great. Thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah, thanks.